Hey there, my name is Chris Acton with Acton Creative, and this is a Handwoven Experience, episode 80. And in this episode, we're going to talk about some knots. See, weavers and knots, we have kind of a love-hate relationship. We love them because knots allow us to keep very even tension in our project, and we use them in a variety of other places during the dressing the loom process. But they're not our favorite when they show up in unwanted places, such as in our cones or tubes of yarn. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is what to do when you find knots in places you don't want them. So let's start from the top. Whether you're using this style of weaving yarn or this, there's a chance you can find knots in your yarn. And what does that mean? In a perfect world, this half-pound tube will be one yarn and it's wound on, no breaks at all. That is not the reality. The reality is that this is probably two or three pieces that have been spliced together. And everywhere it's spliced, you're going to have a little knot. And we've got a couple applications in weaving where you really don't want knots to show up. So we're going to talk about those today and what to do in those instances. So the first spot, as you can guess, is at the warping board. Just a reminder, a warping board, the goal here is to wind on all your warp yarns all the same length and in order, not free. That's what I should add to that equation. So let's say you are working on your project and you find a knot. You've got actually two places at the warping board where knots are acceptable. At the starting peg, wherever you're beginning the project, and at whatever you're using as your last peg at the bottom of the project. We want all the knots to show up either here or here. Well, if they show up, say, right in the middle, we need to address that, because if you have a knot in your warp at your project, the loom, it's going to have trouble going through the heddles and then the reed and get stuck in both those places, and it's going to change the kind of texture of your fabric, and we don't want that. We want it knot free. So here's what we do. See our knot? I didn't pick a great color for this, did I? But there's a knot right in the middle here. Now, in this case, I stopped right when I got to the knot because I want to address it right away. I don't want to wait till later. It's going to affect everything else. So tackle it head on right when you find it. So in this instance, I was coming from the bottom peg back up. And remember what I said, we can have knots at two different places, the starter peg or back here. So here is where my knot is. This whole stretch of yarn then I'm not going to be able to use. So I want this to move back to this peg here. So here's what I recommend. Take your trusty scissors, just trim it right at the knot as close as you can. And this end just kind of put aside for just a moment so that, let's see, I'm going to put that right there under my scissors, just like that. And then I'm going to kind of work this back to my bottom peg here. Come back, take my end like this. I'm just going to tie those ends together. You know what? I'm going to give that a little trim so it's easier. Let's see here. It's easier to do it when you don't have a camera on you. I'm just saying. Okay, so do a little knot right there. Okay, so here, now our knot is back at the bottom peg right there. Doesn't have to be exactly there because you're going to kind of you're going to trim those parts anyways, but now you're back in business. You can bring your warp yarn back up and continue on with your project. So that is the first spot where you might find knots that you really have to deal with them. Just remember, your knots can be at the starter peg or the bottom peg, not anywhere in the middle. Keep that in mind. The other place that you might have to deal with knots in your tube or cone of yarn is actually as you are doing some weaving. So imagine this is at the loom here and you are winding your yarn with the bobbin winder and there's a knot in there. Now, you can address the knot at the bobbin winder if you want, or you can wait till you get to the fabric. And here's what I recommend. Treat it just like you have run out of yarn or changing colors. And so when you're at your fabric here, just take your two ends and just overlap them on either of the edges right there, and it'll work right back into the fabric. The point is to not have knots in your weft yarn going back and forth. So those pesky knots, every so often they show up and put a kink in our plan. But never fear, you've got this. Just give it a little trim, move it back to a safe position, and you can continue on with your weaving. All right, friends, I hope that gave you a couple little nuggets to put in your back pocket for the next time that you run into a knot where you really don't want it. All right, have a great week and happy weaving.